As the director mentioned, that what we're looking for is to learn from things today, and that's what we want to try to make this a learning opportunity for you. So the reason we're here is to provide a forum, an interactive forum. That means I'm not here as a university professor to speak to you. I'm here as a facilitator of discussion and also a technical advisor in the area of results-based management. So if I might just come back to this slide, the key for me is to have a greater awareness and understanding of the principles and approach of the results-based management, so that the ultimate goal here is to be able to implement maybe some of these ideas and objectives into your own systems of monitoring evaluation. I'd like to characterize today as the beginning of potentially a long journey, meaning that first we start with awareness and learning, and the way that we're going to build on that to following our workshop, we'll be having some coaching, mentoring sessions with you, and also with the senior management to look at areas where we might suggest improvements to the process that you have that integrate some of the RBM principles. And this will also form the roadmap for the future for the Merit project to bring to improve the staff capabilities in this area and help make change happen. So by the end of today, the expected results or learning objectives is that hopefully you as participants will better understand the relevance of results-based management approach. It's linked to the project management circle, and most important, how it links to the government regulations and your procedures as you currently do them. In addition, your increased knowledge will help you as we work in the future to integrate some of these universal principles into your processes. And as part of the workshop, we're going to look in the second half about how we might take next steps, what those would be, what the difficulties might be, etc. Now, you all have before you the agenda for today, and I'm just going to do a quick overview of it. So besides our introductory sessions that we're into right now, the key things this morning are going to be two areas. The learning points will be centered around, first of all, the principles and approach to RBM, what it is, etc. After the break, we'll take a look at some of the tools that may not be applicable right now to you, but need to make you aware of they're part of the issue of results-based management. Now, by that time, you'll have a good appetite and we'll have lunch. But after lunch, that's where the work starts, the work part of workshop. So what we'll do then is to hear a presentation of what is your current process in M&E. And then we'll do some group exercises to identify obstacles, opportunities, etc., that the difference of what you're doing and what you've heard in results-based management. And then very important is, I call it the roadmap setting, or what the next steps are. What are we going to do after this workshop? So those will not be in detailed things, but just initial ideas that we'll build on for in the future and in discussions with management and how best to proceed. So as I said earlier, my role today is to increase your knowledge and awareness of what results-based management is. Results-based management has been around for a while. It's an internationally recognized practice. Now it's an approach. It's not a replacement for the management or monitoring and information system. I describe it as a way of thinking and as something that can be easily, well, maybe not easily, but can be adapted to most M&E systems. So that's what we'll be talking about in just a moment here, about what it is, why use it. In other words, what are the benefits to management and others to be able to use this kind of system. So, and the other element as shown on the screen is that of where we'll look at some of the tools, I call it, or elements to implement it. So when I mentioned earlier about coaching and mentoring, this will be a key area to see what might work or areas that we'll explore to be able to integrate the thoughts into practice. So you know, monitoring evaluation is a key part of the project management cycle. So, and I'm wanting to set the context here of what we'll look at specifics of results-based management in a moment. But this is the context of monitoring evaluation first. M&E in itself is a universal practice. Everybody, not everybody, but most government, private, public corporations will use some methodology to be able to monitor and evaluate what's been happening. And the second part to it, be able to feed back to management information to make decisions, changes, adaptations, etc. So as we move along with things, so I just want to be clear that we're all talking about the same things. That's why I'm spending a little bit of time on definitions. So you do it every day, week, and month and this, but it's an ongoing process with the idea that you're collecting and reporting on a regular basis. And this regular reporting is to be able to determine on a basis whether progress is being achieved or not. And where this starts to differentiate with results-based management, the results-based management by the title focuses on results, whereas many systems will focus only on activities and outputs. So in the second part of the E part of it is the evaluation, which is usually at specific points of maybe midterm of a strategic plan or action plan, or at the end of a project. Those are when major evaluations are usually undertaken. Now there's several of you that are in the M&E process but are also very involved in audit. The formal audit information, not information but definition, is along this line. An assessment of the adequacy of management controls to ensure the economic and efficient use of resources. And the other key audit function is compliance with regulation, rules, established policies, and effectiveness of risk management. So it's still a very key management oversight function, whereas it shouldn't be confused with monitoring evaluation because, again, the focus is on results, not compliance. So we've started a little bit about what RBM is not. Now I'd like to speak about what is it. So I've underlined, and key word I keep repeating is approach, that integrates strategies, resources, processes, measurements. That's where it gets a little complicated. But the ultimate result that we are looking to achieve is in fact better decision making, more transparency, more accountability. So this is from Global Affairs Canada, which is the Canadian International Development arm of the Canadian government, and particularly the Merit Project. They have very extensive RBM system in place to be able to achieve these results, to be able to report to Global Affairs Canada. So this is the formal definition, but let's sort of break it down a little. So the first bullet is one of defining and achieving realistic results. So emphasizing defining it means as part of a planning process. So the last part of it is, I would just want to emphasize, because these sort of bullets are the key pillars of our results-based management. So the emphasis is on realistic and results, or another term that is very common is outcomes. It's a more formal term, but it's very common. Okay, so the second bullet is actually implementing systems to monitor progress. And how's that measured? It's through performance indicators. And we'll actually develop some performance indicators in a few moments. And then the other element too is reporting on actual achievements. I'll keep coming back to that theme because that's the real key element of results-based management. So the two other elements are important, and I'll kind of quickly go through them. The results, managing risks. There's a risk that as a technical advisor I was immediately aware of, is the fact if your government changes so dramatically, or in fact, so the risk is very high in that. So this is why the director stays up all night worrying about how to manage those risks and deal with them. So the other important thing too is that why we do this isn't just to report, it's to learn. We call it lessons learned. And that means ways and means that we maybe made a mistake or we had a success. The system has to be able to catch those things, to be able to feed them back, to see if you need to change policy, change direction, whatever. So in summary here, so we can move along, the idea is that this is some key elements of the heart, as I've called it here, of performance measurement. Continuous process, collecting, analyzing information on key indicators, etc. And then the next one is about lessons learned that we just talked about. So why use the RBM approach? Because in chatting with you, I and seeing some of the reports, it's not focused on outcomes and results so much as more of these kind of activities. And this is what we would be looking perhaps in the future to shift away from. So now don't worry, because there's lots of government agencies and private sectors that are in what we call the activity trap. It's very easy to collect this kind of information, how much money and all these kind of things, whether so many training manuals have been prepared. So the government dictates that MRPAM is to be policy developing in certain areas on coal industry, mining, resources, whatever. So we can't do anything about that. We have to do something to be able to assess whether progress is being made to develop those policies. So you take what the policy is, or a strategic plan, which you also have a 5-year strategic plan for the agency, and you look and you see what is the ultimate result they want. And then we see how can we measure, what will show us that we're making progress, the performance indicators. So like you do today, maybe reporting on outputs, we change it to whether they're making progress towards actually achieving policy development in these areas. So actually this next one here is sort of the key, in a few words, the kind of key question that you're asking. So are we making any progress to addressing the issue that we originally set out to resolve? In other words, the example I was using, is there new policy development enacted? So I don't want you and your staff to feel that it's impossible to do. It's something that requires a lot of work to be able to translate the results-based management into your system, your current system, without under the umbrella of Regulation 89, etc. So, and Mr. Director, this initiative with the Merit Project is a wonderful opportunity where your group can look at the ideas of where it's possible to implement some of these areas, and with the ultimate improvement of management decision making and in fact more accountability. Remember I said it's a journey. It's not an easy journey, but one that can be done. And these are international examples. Now I haven't listed governments, but these are government agencies and world international agencies that you can recognize. And of course there's other ones with the Australians, the UK, the Americans, GTZ. So they all have different, as we do and you do, different systems, but they use the RBM approach. And as we'll talk of more, we adapt them to the organization to make them fit rather than forcing it in. It has to recognize the existing environment and also the areas where maybe changes can be made. Now, aside from just outlining the names of the development agencies, I've indicated their websites. And the thing about this is, like for instance, the Canadian one is a how-to-do-it guide. So the specialists in M&E can look into these websites and get into more definitions, especially into the tools and formatting later on that we'll talk about. So I'd like to move to the next thing of what is a result. I keep talking about it, or an outcome. The problem that I said, it can be easily adapted to different organizations. They also use different terminology that confuses the issue as well. The fact is, here's describable and measurable change. Something's happened, resulting from a cause and effect. Cause meaning, if I do put inputs of money and resources into something or other, what will be the effect of it? Then what happens? A new training school is developed. This is a key thing that you will need to come back to and learn in a sense of for the future of what a result outcome is a change, not just an activity. Who of you have heard of the SMART, either performance indicators or results? It's an acronym for being able to remember when you're developing results or performance indicators. So to bring some direction out of chaos, this is one of the ways to be able to go through looking at a result. Is it achievable? Is it measurable and time bound? Mm-hmm. We're going to, over the next 5 years, going to do it, or et cetera, et cetera. So this is a technique that's used both with this and also performance indicators. Just in summary on this of what is a results or outcome statement. Again, it's reinforcing here what the definition is and also the idea of results or changes. The statements also to help you as a tool what, who, and where defines from the SMART indicators into this as well. What is being the type of change expected? Who's the target population? Youth, unemployed youth, for instance, or people in the mining industry, women in the mining industry, that kind of who's the specific target and where is it? Is it in a province or throughout the whole country or an industry? I've taken the liberty here of doing it on this one. Here's a SMART result statement that I've constructed. So the example I have is, this is a SMART result statement. To strengthen the capacity of MRPAM's monitoring evaluation staff to implement a results-based approach to M&E within the agency. So this is what you're doing, who is it targeting, and where kind of thing within the agency. This gets a little more complicated in the tools, and some of the ones I'm going to go over reasonably quickly. One of the things you see that jumps right out, we're going to talk again about SMART, but in this case, performance indicators. So we've learned about what results-based management is and results. Now I'm going to review through some of the international practices and the tools that are associated with this. And may I say up front, I don't want you to get overwhelmed with these. Because some of these things like the logic framework or the logic model or the results chain, it's more of a project oriented. If you're working with donors, international donors, such as the Merit Project, has to have these kind of documents, tools prepared. So again, there will be certain principles that we can adapt to your situation, but it won't be necessarily the same as some of these templates that will be shown. So there's the results chain, the indicators, and the performance measurement framework. And I'll explain what all of those are in detail as we go through here. But one thing I just want to point out is one of the tools is to have operating guidelines and manuals. Now I understand you have government regulations, but I'm not sure that the department has any operating manuals. And the reason I suggest that, sort of going back to earlier slide of how to do things, is very important if your staff changes. So that's an important thing to be able to refer somewhere online or in a paper product to be able to look and see what the actual process is. So let's, again, to clarify what the meaning of these different areas are, like results chain or logic model. So it's a flow between the inputs, activities, and the outcomes. I'll show you in a moment a visual representation of that. But what I like to call it is a roadmap or blueprint to show what you're trying to achieve, to bring all these results we've talked about, put them in a clear, logical progression. So let me give you an example here that I've come up with that may not be 100% true, but so it's cause and effect of the activity. Here's the example I'd like to bring forward. So to ensure the agency's petroleum sites are in compliance with various policies and regulations. That's the activity. So the output of it is that the compliance audit is conducted, and the other output is that the policy awareness training has been organized and delivered. As a result, there's been an increased level of knowledge and compliance on policy requirements in the agency's operating petroleum site. So that was an example. Now let's look at these levels. So Global Affairs Canada again, which is the foundation of our presentation, has a logic model or results change that's divided into 6 levels. As you can see here, there's initial ones that we've talked about that are marked in red about activities, outputs, and the likes. These basically represent how are we affecting the change or result. And the next levels start to go into the, and it's broken down into the hows. How are we achieving it? The bottom 3 are, and this is again not necessarily appropriate for your organization, but there's immediate change or outcomes, short term. There's intermediate, medium term, and what we were talking about earlier, ultimate outcomes or impacts, the long term. So again, this is what Global Affairs uses, but most organizations collapse these, just have. So in my opinion, for your organization, the 3 outcome levels are too complicated and not needed. The objective would be to make this simple process as possible, not a complex one. I'll explain this more in detail in just a moment. This is what I was talking about. In 5 years, we want to make changes to increase the economic activity of Mongolia in the petroleum industry. That's the long term. The next are short-term and intermediate ones. And what this means is the idea the immediate is short-term outcomes or results that change in ability or skills, something like learning English language. In this model that I'm showing you, the intermediate one or midterm is a change in behavior or practice. So let me, in the example we're using, that the change in behavior is now that the staff can now discuss and work out arrangements with international agencies. So the idea is they break it down in the short term where you can see some effect on it, but this is in longer term that the language has been achieved for the staff development. So the skills have been acquired at that immediate stage. But the next level is there's been a change in behavior. So this is a breakdown that the international agencies do. And I present it as an example of an international model, but not necessarily the way that you would work here. The value, though, of even a visual chart, as many organizations have of this, it very clearly spells out. I mean, it takes work to do this, but it very clearly spells out what your ultimate impact is and what your other but it's a very valuable tool to work through this process to be able to see what these activities, what impact it has in the short and the long term. So that's one of the tools that we use in RBM. So the example I'm using, a statement is to strengthen the capacity of the MRPAM's monitoring evaluation staff to implement a results-based approach to M&E within the agency. So what it basically is what we're doing. Okay, we're looking to build your capacity and not just the individual but also the system's capacity to introduce RBM. So how would we tell if we're successful or not, or achieve some results? Starting point, you've got, again, sort of working in real terms in your department of how these indicators might show results. Performance indicators formally we'll talk about for a moment or two. Sometimes you hear them by these other terms, key performance indicators, KPIs, or objective verifiable indicators. That's a big long word sort of for SMART indicators. But I've broken these down into 3 categories, but in fact it's mainly the first 2 are the priorities. I don't mean that cross-cutting reporting and indicators is not important, but just at this stage we're focusing on the departmental things. So the most frequently used is the number 1, quantitative. So sometimes qualitative is very useful as well. And let me just review over the definition of an individual or team's judgment or perception. That the idea there is it's in your mind in a sense, or a group like right now will make a consensus as to whether these are good performance indicators or not. It's your perception of it. We're not going to take a vote and say 1, 2, 3. That's the qualitative one. So what I'd like to talk about next is the performance management framework, the PMF. Now, again, I'll preface this with the idea that this may be a little too involved for our particular department, but I can't let it go that it is an important tool in RBM for some organizations. I believe you have something, maybe not quite exact as this, but have something similar that lays out the approach to collect information. So this is introducing the international practice using a PMF or performance measurement framework. There's some values to having it because it helps conceptualize projects by asking fundamental questions of stakeholders. So as you can see, it's sort of a who, what, when, and why kind of thing again. So although this may not be, as I said, relevant, the PMF to you, the idea is still very valuable about going through this series of questions. So it has a number of the format, and I didn't do one that has an example on the screen, but it brings together expected results from the original logic or results chain and the performance indicators that we talked about. And then it includes baseline and targets. Now we'll speak next about those in a little more detail. But this also lays out, as I believe you have, where you find the information, how you're collecting it, the frequency, and who's responsible for it. As you know, in monitoring, evaluation, and results-based management in particular, having a clear starting point is a really important area. It's extremely difficult to measure if you don't know where the starting point is. So this can be tied into action plans or strategic plans or specific dates. And targets, you're generally familiar with it in your context, but this sort of formally describes it. So when we get into the coaching, we'll have to look at your very complex targeting system. The regulations call for a formula to be figured out, and from what I understand, nobody has been trained in how to do it. So as we close this particular part of the session, I'd like to just speak about reporting and tracking progress. As I mentioned at the very beginning about what results-based management is about, it basically provides management and stakeholders the information of what has worked and what has not worked. And the other thing I'd like to just briefly go back to is the reporting side of things. We talked a little, you do a very unusual system of every month collecting. Not that management doesn't do this elsewhere, but it's the intensity of the reporting and how frequently it's happening needs to be maybe looked at. And in truth makes the monitoring and evaluation units work a little lighter if you don't do it every month, as well as the reporting group. They maybe just concentrate on giving you better information rather than just pushing out a Friday report. So that's maybe something when we get into the next stage here of we can look at, again, recommendations being put forward. And the final point with reporting is computerization as much as possible. Because remember our performance indicator about reducing paper? I've talked about lessons learned, and so this is an experience from the UNDP on RBM. And the idea here is that it reinforces what I said, that you don't just take some, like the Government of Canada's system and impose it. You have to make it your own. And I hope in subsequent meetings and discussions that with senior management that this is an area where we can look at of setting clear objectives to make improvements in RBM. And the second bullet of sort of customizing the system to your own organization. So the actual implementing and even our training today is a learning experience in itself about RBM. So if you try things and it doesn't work, you adapt and change it. And I think you'll like this last bullet. You'll still have a workload, don't worry about that, but the idea that it's more concise and precise